What would it mean to be born into a family where blood does not branch outward but folds back upon itself, turning again and again, until father, uncle, and husband all wear the same face? In the deep Appalachian backwoods, there are hollows where silence shelters more than poverty, it shelters lineage. Tonight, we step into one such hollow. This is the story of the girl who married her father's twin, a tale not preserved in church records or county rolls, but in whispers, erased Bibles, and cabins abandoned to rot. It is a story enforced by a grandmother's doctrine, where children were born as echoes of one another, and where a bloodline collapsed upon itself until nothing survived but rumor. Welcome to Gothic Ledger. Before we begin, let me ask you something. Where are you watching from, and what time is it for you right now? Write it in the comments below. It helps us see just how far these stories travel from one haunted hollow to another. And if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe and leave a like so you won't miss the histories that most would rather forget. In the chapters ahead, we will move through this silence into a cabin where mirrors were draped in cloth, where a girl's mother became her sister, and where the meanings of father, brother, and son blurred until they lost distinction entirely. What follows will unfold with the precision of a case file, yet its resonance belongs as much to folklore as to history. So let us return to a ridge where no census taker lingered, where a doctrine of symmetry was written in both ink and silence, and where one girl's fate sealed the downfall of an entire bloodline. In the Appalachian backwoods, silence was never an absence of sound. It was a presence, heavy, deliberate, a silence that veiled more than hardship. It veiled bloodlines. Among ridges and shadowed valleys, records thinned, names blurred, and families existed only as rumors whispered around fires. This hollow was one such place. The very terrain discouraged intrusion. A dirt track wound inward from the main road, narrowing until it vanished into underbrush. Those who pressed deep enough remarked on the stillness, bird-song muffled footsteps swallowed by earth itself. Geography offered protection, and protection hardened into secrecy. By the late 1800s, census takers no longer bothered. Reports note agents turning back at the ridge citing rough terrain or households unwilling to answer. Yet maps show faint marks of scattered cabins' outlines traced by hand but left nameless. These omissions were not careless mistakes. They were silence's deliberate absences, etched into official paper reflecting the unspoken absences within the hollow itself. The families who remained lived by superstition. Oral tradition speaks of cabins whose doors never opened to strangers, where bolts slid home at the sound of footsteps. Woven twig charms hung above thresholds, not to ward off spirits but to signal to neighbors that bloodlines were guarded, the circle unbroken. Outsiders were not just unwelcome, they were feared as though any foreign blood, any foreign knowledge might shatter the hollow's fragile balance. Accounts gathered decades later describe an unspoken code. Families intermarried only among themselves, shared labor solely with their own kin, and met questions with suspicion. When school officials came seeking pupils, the reply was always, "No children here." When preachers arrived, sermons were delivered to closed doors. The hollow lived as though unseen, preserving itself in silence, as though silence itself were a mission. From this silence, folklore was born. Travelers claimed to hear voices carried strangely through the valley, though no figure appeared. Some swore to glimpse pale children at windows, vanishing at the instant of notice. The hollow always offered just enough to unsettle, never enough to prove. Silence became its shield and also its prison. To historians, the hollow emerges not in presence, but in absence, in names missing from tax rolls, in blank spaces, on parish registers, in family Bibles with their generations scorched away. What remains is residue, as though the hollow's truest story exists only in what was erased. And here within that erasure, the girl's story begins. She was born into a lineage that folded inward on itself in a place where strangers did not enter and kin did not speak. The hollow was not simply her home, it was the architecture of her destiny, a geography that concealed bloodlines as carefully as it concealed its paths. Hers was a birth from blood, already turned inward, a child carried not toward the future, but deeper into repetition where kinship had already tangled beyond recognition. Elsewhere in 19th century Appalachia, a birth was marked with church bells, baptisms, neighbors, bringing bread and prayers. In this hollow, the event passed almost without a word, as though silence itself acted as midwife. No county record preserves her arrival. No christening entry marks her in the parish book. She exists only in a tattered Bible hidden in her grandmother's cabin. The entry was faint. Ink had bled into the paper fibers, the date blurred, uncertain. Where most family Bibles held careful genealogies, father-mother, children neatly recorded in succession, this page contained only a single name, unanchored, stripped of parentage. Later generations would whisper that the script looked hurried, as though written in fear of being seen. What the Bible concealed, rumor supplied. Neighbors speaking years after recalled hushed talk that the girl's father had also been her mother's father. In Appalachian oral tradition, such stories were rarely named outright. They lingered instead like smoke recognized but never spoken clearly. To call the child illegitimate would have been too simple. She was something else entirely, both daughter and granddaughter, her existence itself unsettling the categories by which kinship was usually understood. The cabin where she opened her eyes remained shuttered. No bells were rung, no preacher summoned. From the beginning, her grandmother, a stern, unyielding woman, insisted the child must be shielded from all outside acknowledgement. Some neighbors later claimed the windows were blackened for weeks, that smoke rose only at strange hours as though the family lived their days in reverse. In a community where births were normally marked by ritual and shared joy, hers began in silence and concealment. The absence was intentional. Civil registries had begun pressing into the mountains, and yet census takers who passed through the hollow returned with fewer names than cabins. They noted evasions, refusals, and families who resisted enumeration entirely. The girl's birth lived inside these silences, a fact without documentation, a life without announcement. Later, when researchers tried to trace her lineage, contradictions multiplied. One source swore she was the daughter of the eldest son. Another whispered she was the child of the father himself. Both in their own way could have been true. In Appalachian genealogies, where names repeated across generations and bloodlines doubled back upon themselves, certainty was less common than speculation. She was a shadow within shadows, seen but never confirmed. Her arrival into the world did not brighten the hollow but darkened it further, tightening the circle of secrecy. Most children were paraded proudly in church, inscribed in county ledgers held high as proof of continuity. She instead became a fact to be hidden, recorded only in a single book that never left her grandmother's cabin. She was not introduced to the community. She was concealed within it. Her life from its very first breath was marked by omission, by silence, by the faintest trace of ink on brittle paper. Her caretaker was not her mother, but her grandmother. From the girl's earliest days, the older woman's presence overshadowed all others. In a hollow where matriarchs often outlived and outruled men, the grandmother's word carried the weight of scripture. She claimed guardianship without resistance, declaring herself the sole authority over the child's existence. Such arrangements were not unheard of in Appalachia. Widows and elder women often commanded households. But here, the grandmother's rule was not protection. It was concealment. Her authority was designed not only to raise the child, but to erase the truth of her origins. Neighbors remembered how the girl was never called daughter, never niece, never kin of any specific kind. When acknowledged at all, she was introduced simply as mine. The grandmother's phrasing left no gaps for inquiry, no openings for curiosity. Within that household, family roles were rewritten under her hand. The girl's mother became little more than a shadow, treated as a sister, at best a servant at worst. In this domestic order, the grandmother was custodian, jailer, and historian at once. She fed the child, clothed her, and monitored her every movement. Even the Bible, the sole surviving record of her existence, bore only the grandmother's handwriting. Entries resembled ledgers more than lineages. Names, trim dates, adjusted the story, reshaped to match the narrative she demanded others believe. Her control extended beyond the written word. She schooled the girl in silence. She taught which questions could never be asked, which truths must never be spoken. Outsiders were dangerous. Churches were untrustworthy. Officials could not be allowed inside. "We take ye care of our own," she repeated again and again, a phrase that in the hollow carried a double-weight provision and confinement. The child was to be raised both as kin and as secret. Such concealment had precedent. Oral histories from other Appalachian hollows tell of children introduced under false parentage, mothers recast as aunts, and fathers erased altogether. These shifts in kinship were not merely lies, they were survival strategies, shields against scandal or law. But here the grandmother's methods were unusually rigid, almost ritualistic, as though she believed that renaming could alter reality itself. If the girl ever retained her earliest memories, they would have been shaped by restriction. She did not step beyond the cabin without her grandmother's hand at her elbow. She was not permitted to play with neighboring children. She was trained to drop her gaze when strangers passed, as though her very face might betray a forbidden lineage. Her life was molded into an extension of her grandmother's will. Protection, control, concealment woven so tightly that they became indistinguishable. Her mother lived under the same roof, but never named herself as such. Within those walls, the woman moved like a ghost, present in body, absent in role. She was presented to the child and to the rare visitor as a sister. This was no accident. In communities where the suspicion of incest was a sin too great to name, silence became defense. To preserve the family, the grandmother rewrote kinship terms. The truth that the girl's mother was also her father's daughter was unspeakable. To bury it, the mother's title was stripped away. She lived neither as matron nor guardian, but as a figure without category. Similar cases exist in other hollows. Infants claimed by grandmothers, aunts transformed into mothers, true mothers reduced to nameless roles. For this woman, it meant a life of erasure. Neighbors recalled her as pale, subdued, her voice little more than a murmur. She fetched water, tended fires, sewed in silence. When the child reached for her, she offered little more than stillness. When others looked her way, she lowered her eyes. To share a roof with her daughter and yet be forbidden to claim her, this was a slow vanishing carried out in plain sight. The Bible itself reinforced her absence. Where other families recorded descent carefully, here, the mother's name was left blank, a gap, as intentional as the grandmother's refusals to census takers. Witnesses later remembered her only faintly sitting with sewing in hand, but speaking rarely, as though her role in the household had been written out of existence. Some thought she resembled a sister more than a mother. In repeating the family's own manufactured story, they unknowingly gave voice to its intent. This suppression was more than social, it was cultural. In the Appalachian Mountains, secrecy was often the only form of survival, and family roles could be rewritten to shield fragile households from shame. But in this hollow secrecy hardened into something else, a ritual so complete that the girl's mother might as well have been a ghost. She lived and breathed, labored and endured, yet history denied her any title. She held no claim to the child she had borne. Thus the girl grew in the grandmother's grasp, while her true mother, present but never named, faded into a silence that resembled death. She was not gone, but she had been erased. Two men stood in the household mirror images, yet only one was her father. Within the hollow, the existence of identical twins was both fact and complication. The brothers were almost indistinguishable, each with the same angular jaw, the same pale eyes, the same deliberate gait. To outsiders, they appeared uncanny, like a figure doubled. To the family, their sameness offered something darker, a way to divide shame between two bodies, to scatter guilt across reflections. In 19th century Appalachian folklore, twins carried mixed meanings. Some saw them as blessings, proof that God had doubled his gifts. Others whispered that they were omens, unnatural signs that one soul had been split in two. Superstitions claimed that when one twin sickened, the other would follow, or that if one stared too long into a mirror, the other might vanish. The hollow absorbed such tales but twisted them into doctrine. For this family likeness became not superstition, but justification. Later testimonies suggested that the brothers were treated as interchangeable. Neighbors, when pressed, often faltered, uncertain which twin they had spoken to. One woman said it felt like meeting the same man twice. This confusion served the family well. If suspicion ever arose about the father of a child, the existence of his double blurred the accusation. Who was father? Who was uncle? Who was both? No clear line could be drawn. The girl herself grew up within this distortion. She was told of her father, but when he stood beside his brother, she could not distinguish him. The grandmother encouraged this confusion, insisting it was divine symmetry, that the bloodline was so strong it had replicated itself perfectly. Within this belief, incest was not corruption but alignment, as though her parentage had been sanctified by the doubling of men. Regional Bibles often recorded twins carefully with notations or special marks, but in this family's Bible the entries blurred. One name was written beneath the other, as though repetition itself were the record. Researchers later found the ink smeared between them, suggesting deliberate ambiguity, or perhaps a single name copied twice to simulate two men. To outsiders, the twins were unsettling. Visitors spoke of the eerie sight of entering the cabin and finding both men seated side by side, silent, identical in posture and gaze. Some turned away, quickly, unnerved by the impression of facing not two men, but one repeated. Folk belief called such visions doppelgangers, omens of death. In this hollow, they were ordinary life. The brothers themselves did little to distinguish their identities. They dressed alike, kept their hair the same, and often answered for each other. Whether this was deliberate or simply habit, the effect was the same individuality dissolved into symmetry. Two bodies, one presence. No way to separate father from brother. For the girl, this meant her lineage was not only taboo but unstable. Her father existed, but so did his twin. In their mirrored faces, she saw both her origin and her fate. The truth could be blurred and shame itself divided, doubled, and hidden in their reflection. The girl grew where no strangers ever looked upon her face. From infancy through adolescence, her world stretched no farther than the cabin walls and the narrow hollow that enclosed it. She knew the creak of the floorboards more intimately than the sound of a school bell. She traced the bark of familiar trees but never followed the roads beyond. Childhood for her was not discovery. It was confinement. In rural Appalachia, homeschooling was common enough, born of distance, poverty, and distrust of outsiders. But the girl's exclusion was different. It was deliberate. Her guardians, especially the grandmother, forbade all contact with churches, schools, or census takers. Her knowledge was confined to what could be taught indoors: the repetition of psalms, the skill of sewing, the discipline of tending a fire. Literacy, if granted, was piecemeal, limited to Bible verses and the careful copying of names. When census men came asking after children, the family repeated their mantra, "No children here." Rumors, however, leaked. Neighbors spoke of glimpses: a pale child at a window, a figure slipping behind trees when strangers approached. One man remembered a thin girl with wide eyes staring out from the dark. Another recalled passing the cabin and seeing her briefly on the porch before the grandmother appeared and pulled her swiftly inside. These impressions did not suggest a child at play, but a watchful creature shaped by silence. Her days followed a rigid pattern. Dawn began with chores: hauling water, sweeping the hearth, preparing meals. Afternoons were filled with lessons less educational than disciplinary sewing, by candlelight reciting scripture, memorizing household law that warned against outsiders. Evenings ended in hush shutters drawn as if the family sought invisibility from the very land itself. What marked her most deeply was the absence of peers. Childhood is meant to be social, but she knew only the company of elders. Her speech reflected this formal, restrained, echoing adult cadence rather than childish tones. Those who remembered her voice later said it carried an odd gravity, as though laughter had been withheld from her for years. Anthropological studies of Appalachian hollows describe similar cases: children hidden from communal life to conceal illegitimacy, deformities, or incest. In each isolation bred hypervigilance eyes that watched too closely, mannerisms that imitated adults, suspicion of strangers that endured into adulthood. The girl was no different. She grew, but her growth was constrained. Her face rarely saw the sun. Her feet rarely touched roads beyond the hollow. She belonged not to the world, but to its shadow. Childhood for her was not innocence. It was absence. Within that absence, she became unforgettable, a pale, watchful child, raised under her grandmother's iron hand, hidden from a world forbidden to know her. The grandmother's doctrine shaped everything. She taught that blood repeats like scripture. Within the cabin, doctrine was not read from pulpits, but spoken from her lips. Where other families leaned on the King James Bible, she stitched together her own theology from verses, superstition, and the peculiar circumstances of her kin. Symmetry was her creed. To her, the presence of identical twins in the bloodline was not chance, but providence. It proved the family had been chosen to embody a pattern. Twins were balanced, two bodies sharing one essence. To marry within such symmetry was not corruption, but continuation. What outsiders condemned as incest, she sanctified as alignment. In her faith, repetition was purity. This manipulation of belief was not without foundation. It drew from deep cultural roots. In the Appalachian Highlands, folk religion often blurred the boundary between Christian teaching and far older traditions. Scripture coexisted with charms. Psalms were recited alongside whispered superstitions. In isolated hollows where ministers seldom reached and officials were distrusted, these mixtures hardened into local creeds, unchallenged, unquestioned, and passed down as absolute law. The grandmother knew this well. She drew selectively from the Bible, lifting verses that spoke of unity of flesh and bending them until they became endorsements of inward-turning unions. Marriage between kin, she declared, was not corruption, but a circle unbroken, echoing the hymns sung in mountain churches, yet twisting their meaning until the words sanctified her own household. Rituals enforced the doctrine. At night she gathered the girl close, whispering scripture not always straight, but sometimes inverted, as though the very reversal carried its own power. She pressed the family Bible into the child's hands, demanding she trace the names written in fading ink, learning them not as mere genealogy, but as prayers. Blood, she told her, is scripture written in flesh. To keep it unbroken is to remain faithful. This was not the absence of faith, but its excess faith distorted into oppression. Every act in the household was charged with sacred weight. The twin brothers were not only men, but eternal mirrors. A shared meal was not simply food, but a covenant. Even silence itself became a ritual of devotion, a refusal to let unclean words slip into the air. The girls' lessons were not in arithmetic or geography, but in the steady layering of this creed until no other world could exist beyond it. Neighbors on distant ridges, separated only by the thin walls of mountain air, later recalled catching fragments of these sermons. One man said, "The grandmother's voice carried like preaching filled with fervor as she spoke of two made one." Another remembered that the brothers were never addressed as individuals, but only as the pair their mirrored presence elevated above identity, above humanity. Deprived of any alternative, the girl absorbed it all as truth. To her, blood was not just heritage but destiny. To marry beyond the family was spoken of as betrayal both against kin and against God. Perfection, she was told, was never found in branching outward but in circling back, blood folding upon itself until all difference vanished. Thus, in this hollow faith became distortion. Religion once meant to liberate was remade into chains. And under the grandmother's hand, incest was not spoken of as shame, but as sanctity, a creed carved into silence, passed down like scripture, and imposed upon a child who had never heard another truth. At 13, the girl's future was sealed not by choice but by blood. Early marriage was not unusual in Appalachia. Records from the 19th century speak of girls wed in their early teens, often justified by poverty survival or the promise of binding land between families. But here the reason was darker. In this hollow marriage was not survival, it was symmetry. The grandmother arranged it without hesitation. To her, the girl's body was not her own, but the vessel of doctrine, the continuation of a sacred pattern. And so the chosen groom was not a stranger, not even a distant cousin. It was the twin, the identical brother of the girl's own father. In the grandmother's logic, this was not defiance against morality, but its ultimate fulfillment. Incest, she argued, did not exist when the bloodline met itself in perfect symmetry. It was not corruption, but alignment. The proposal itself was less invitation than decree. No suitor came with gifts. No kin gathered to negotiate. Instead, the grandmother opened the Bible, pointed to the genealogy, and showed where the girl's name had already been written beneath a blank space waiting for the twin. The marriage had been arranged in ink before it was ever spoken aloud. Elsewhere in Appalachia, family Bibles served as the only legal record of unions with names written down, even when no county clerk or minister had ever blessed the event. For most, this was born of necessity. But in this hollow, it became something more, a manipulation of history, a deliberate rewriting of kinship to hide what could not be confessed publicly. The Bible was not merely a record. It was a shield where names could be arranged to disguise forbidden truths. The girl's voice in all this is absent. At 13, she carried no agency, no power to refuse. In mountain tradition, a daughter's consent was seldom sought in such matters. But here, it was not simply overlooked, it was erased entirely. She was not asked, she was placed. Her fate determined not by her will, but by the grandmother's handwriting. The union was sanctified not by love or choice, but by the close circle of blood. Neighbors remembered only fragments, vague murmurs of a marriage whispered through the trees. No one was invited, yet some swore they heard the grandmother speaking of blessings, insisting the match was cleansing, a correction of shame. Others whispered of a pale child, silent, resigned, a girl with no say in a decision older than she was. This fatalism runs through every surviving account of the event. A marriage less like a union than an inevitability carved into doctrine long before the girl had even drawn her first breath. This was not a marriage to be celebrated. It was a sentence carried out. The girl's path narrowed to a single inevitability, her future carved before she could shape it herself. From birth, her fate had been decided. At 13, it was sealed with ritual. What elsewhere might have been a proposal became in the hollow an edict. The grandmother's voice spoke louder than law, louder than scripture, louder even than the girl's own silence. The union was not the meeting of two individuals. It was imposed by blood, bound by symmetry, entered without choice. No church bells rang. No kin gathered. The only sound was whispering in a cabin hushed and heavy, pressing against the wooden walls. Where other Appalachian weddings were occasions of feasting laughter and community hers unfolded in secrecy. It was not meant to be celebrated. It was meant to be hidden. 19th century rural records confirm that unlicensed marriages were common in the mountains. Ministers were scarce, courthouses distant, and many families simply recorded unions in their Bibles. Such arrangements carried weight within the community even if the state never acknowledged them. But in this hollow informality served another purpose. It ensured that no official eye ever witnessed what had taken place. The ceremony was confined to a single room. The grandmother presided not as witness but as officiant, declaring the union sanctified by blood itself. The twin stood beside the girl, his face indistinguishable from her father's. The family Bible lay open on the table pages already inscribed with their names. No license, no clock, no registry, only ink on paper written by a hand that would never leave the hollow. Folklore tells of mountain rituals where scripture was read in reverse words, unraveled into a sound believed to ward off curses. In this cabin, inversion became the centerpiece of the rite. Psalms were spoken backward, syllables collapsing into guttural weight. To outsiders, it would have sounded like corruption of the holy word. To the grandmother, it was purification. She claimed the act erased sin, cleansing the union of impurity. Few witnessed the scene. A neighbor later recalled hearing muffled chanting through an open window, though she could not catch the words. Another swore she saw candlelight flickering inside when the house should have been dark. To them, the event seemed less a wedding than a ritual binding not for union but for secrecy. The girl remained silent. Her presence was necessary. Her consent was not. When the grandmother closed the Bible, the marriage was declared complete. No ring, no kiss, no proclamation, only the scratch of ink, the extinguishing of candles, and a silence so final it felt as if the cabin itself had swallowed the act into its walls. In official records, the marriage never existed. No minister wrote it into parish rolls. No clerk entered it into the county books. Beyond the hollow, the girl remained unmarried. Yet within those walls, the doctrine of symmetry had been fulfilled. She had been bound not to a stranger, but to the mirror of her father, the twin who bore the same face, the same blood, and perhaps, if whispers are true, the same claim. Thus the ceremony passed like a shadow. No bells rang. No congregation bore witness. Only whispers remained carried by neighbors who suspected but never proved. A marriage without sanction. A covenant sealed not by faith, but by secrecy. Its only witness was the silence that had always defined the hollow. Who was her husband and who was her father? The blood made no distinction. With the girl bound to her father's identical twin, even language faltered. Kinship collapsed into confusion. Father, uncle, husband. Each word circled endlessly back to the same face. And when children were born of this union, the disarray deepened. Technically, they were the offspring of the girl's husband. Yet by blood, they were also the grandchildren of her father, who shared the same face, the same line, and perhaps the same claim. Anthropologists studying Appalachian kinship note how terms could bend, how aunt or uncle sometimes substituted for absent parents. But here, substitution dissolved entirely. The children were simultaneously nieces, nephews, and grandchildren of the same men. The very family Bibles that should have anchored genealogy only magnified the confusion. The grandmother's handwriting, though careful and deliberate, revealed more through its omissions than through what it recorded. Births were noted, but never with titles. No father, no uncle, no grandchild, only names one beneath another, inscribed not as branches of a tree, but as circles upon circles. Decades later, researchers studying the record observed that it resembled not a family tree at all, but a wheel. Lines bent inward instead of outward, folding back on themselves, turning endlessly instead of reaching forward. It was a genealogy without direction, a lineage that refused to expand. For neighbors already uneasy, this lack of structure mirrored their own confusion. When pressed to explain the children's place within the household, one woman muttered helplessly, "They were all kin every which way." Another recalled being told the children were doubly blessed, a flattering phrase meant to disguise what could not be spoken aloud. Where clarity was dangerous, ambiguity became a shield. Anthropologists studying similar insular communities would later note the disorientation born of incestuous structures, where children often bore contradictory roles, brother and cousin, uncle and son. This confusion did not remain confined to language. It seeped into daily life. Authority faltered, respect blurred, and even discipline carried a strange uncertainty. Who was father? The man who shared the girl's bed, or the man whose face he wore? For the children themselves, identity became less an inheritance than a paradox. Some accounts claim they bore an uncanny resemblance to both brothers, as if heredity itself had refused to choose. Others described their mannerisms as synchronized, eerily reflecting the mirrored bond of their father and uncle. To outsiders, these children appeared less like individuals than like living reflections, products of a circle that could not break. For historians, such collapse of categories is almost impossible to document. Records seek clarity, distinct names, defined roles. Yet here the very archive falters. The evidence dissolves into uncertainty, not as error but as structure itself. In the hollow kinship terms had grown hollow too. Father became uncle, uncle became husband, husband blurred into both. Children became grandchildren, grandchildren became nephews. Blood no longer stretched forward in lines, but collapsed inward, erasing the very language meant to order it. Neighbors whispered, but none dared speak aloud. By the 1880s, silence in the hollow was no longer absolute, only carefully guarded. Families on the surrounding ridges carried fragments of knowledge, sightings, suspicions, stories too troubling to voice openly. They knew a girl had been married young, that her husband's face was the mirror of her father's, and that the children born from the cabin seemed like reflections rather than descendants. But in those mountains, words carried weight. To speak too directly was to invite danger, so rumor became the only safe record. Oral histories preserve these whispers. Neighbors lowered their voices when the family was mentioned. Some referred to them only as the pair, or the circle, never daring to name them directly. One man remembered his mother's warning, "Never cross into the hollow, the blood there runs in a loop." Another recalled that when children asked who lived beyond the ridge, elders would reply, "Nobody you need to know." These evasions were their own kind of testimony, acknowledgement without admission, recognition without record. Attempts to bring concerns to county authorities went nowhere. Officials dismissed complaints as outside their jurisdiction. Court ledgers from the period reveal no prosecutions, no investigations. Marginal notes by census takers mention only reluctant households and avoidance recommended. One clerk wrote plainly, "Not our jurisdiction." But this was less about jurisdiction than about reluctance. The Hollow was hard to reach its families, hostile to strangers, its reputation unsettling. Officials preferred silence to confrontation. This was not unusual in Appalachia. Geography and isolation often shielded families from scrutiny. Remote hollows were seen as self-governing, their disputes resolved internally, their secrets left undisturbed. To interfere risked hostility, even violence. And for families who paid no taxes and offered no cooperation, county sheriffs had little incentive to stir trouble. The family in question exploited this indifference, sustaining their close circle under the cover of official neglect. Meanwhile, rumors thickened. A passing midwife swore she saw a child whose eyes were set too close, as though a mirror had doubled him wrong. A farmhand claimed he heard chanting in the night psalms recited backward in the dark. Unverifiable but persistent such tales fed suspicion. Folklore grew where law refused to tread. Paranoia seeped into daily life. Some neighbors refused to trade goods with the family, fearing contamination. Others avoided the narrow paths leading into the hollow, whispering of unseen eyes that watched travelers from the shadows. Stories circulated of pale children staring from cabin windows, silent and still vanishing when noticed. Each account, though unverifiable, reinforced the sense that something unnatural lived there. Yet no one dared confront it. The result was a silence layered atop whispers neighbors knew, officials avoided, and the hollow endured. The truth remained unspoken, not because it was unknown, but because it was unspeakable. To name it aloud would be to invite it closer. Better to let the hollow remain sealed, its world closed upon itself. History therefore preserved nothing official, only murmurs. And in those murmurs the family survived not as record, but as rumor, half remembered by those who chose distance over disclosure. Their family tree had become a circle with no branches. Where genealogy should clarify descent, each generation moving forward, each line extending outward, this record folded inward, erasing distinctions until all roles blurred together. The family Bible illustrates this collapse with chilling precision. Names were entered but never titles. The grandmother's hand recorded births and deaths without noting who begat whom. The girl first listed as a child later reappeared beneath her husband's name, though his face mirrored her father's. Their offspring were listed below without distinction of kinship. No son, no daughter, no grandchild. To any reader, the entries formed not a tree but a chain looped endlessly around itself. Anthropological accounts of Appalachia note that insularity often warped kinship language. Aunts called sisters, stepfathers called uncles, grandparents, addressed as mother or father according to convenience. But here distortion had collapsed into erasure. Words meant to structure family life no longer held meaning. A child might call the grandmother Ma, the mother Sis, and the uncle Pa all within a single breath. Outsiders found these contradictions baffling. Insiders accustomed to circular reasoning accepted them as natural. Parish records that might have clarified the matter are conspicuously absent. The nearest church later admitted that the family had not appeared in its rolls for decades. Baptisms, marriages, burials, all conducted privately, written only in the cabin Bible. Without outside validation, the family's version of lineage became the only version, one in which generations blurred until past and present overlapped. This claustrophobia of descent shaped daily life inside the cabin. The grandmother's authority, though rooted in the past, still dominated as if she were both matriarch and parent. The girl, now wife and mother, was still treated as a child. Her offspring were seen less as new lives than as repetitions, echoes of what had already existed. To live in that household was to exist within perpetual recurrence, where nothing was truly new, only mirrored. Neighbors trying to describe it fell back on circular imagery. They kept to their own, one said, like a wheel that never broke. Another remarked, you couldn't tell who belonged to which age. Everyone seemed kin twice over. Vague though they are, such statements reflect the impossibility of drawing clear lines where the family itself had erased them. For the historian, the archive yields only frustration. The ordinary tools of genealogy, names, dates, relationships, collapse into ambiguity. The grandmother was both mother and guardian, the daughter both child and wife, and the children at once descendants and siblings. Every role overlapped, every category blurred until no clear line remained. To write their genealogy was to sketch a circle closed, rootless, without branches, without growth. In the hollow, generations did not succeed one another. They folded together, compressed like layers of silence pressed too tightly to be separated. What should have been a lineage became instead a loop. And within that loop, identity itself dissolved. The children bore marks that no doctor could name. Though births went unrecorded and death's unmarked memory and rumor preserved them, physical and mental signs that hinted at more than hardship, something inherited, something that circled back on itself. Neighbors, though reluctant, remembered their faces. One spoke of eyes set unnaturally close, as if symmetry itself had collapsed inward. Another recalled mouths that formed shapes but released only half words, sounds broken and incomplete. The silence of the cabin seemed to cling to their speech, delayed, distorted, stunted. To outsiders, they appeared slow, but those who had listened insisted it was different, not absence of thought, but words caught behind glass. Stranger still was their mimicry. Even when not twin siblings mirrored one another with eerie precision. One child raised a cup, and another's hand twitched in the same arc. One laughed a short, stilted sound, and another echoed it moments later, identical in tone and rhythm. Witnesses swore this was not learned behavior. It was instinctive, as if their very blood bound them to mirrored symmetry. Medical notes from rural physicians in the late 19th century list the common afflictions of Appalachian hollows, clubfoot, cleft palate, speech impediments. These were blamed on malnutrition, poor midwifery, and consanguineous unions. Yet the children of this hollow resisted such neat categories. No single defect explained their sameness, their synchronized gestures, their voices rising together without intent. One doctor, when pressed, dismissed it as nervous imitation. Yet his notes betray unease, as though he sensed something he dared not define. Speech delay was most common. Many of the children spoke years later than their peers, some not forming words until adolescence. Even then, their language was narrow phrases, repeated, never invented. Words circled back on themselves like their lineage. Their speech was echo, not expression. Neighbors said it was impossible to know whether they understood or only repeated. Physical deformities appeared subtly. Eyes, misaligned jaws, skewed limbs marked by faint asymmetry. None remarkable alone, but together they suggested a pattern, a body strained by repetition. No photographs survive, but oral accounts describe siblings who looked too much alike, not only resembling their parents, but each other to an unsettling degree. They seemed less like individuals than replications, reflections in a chain of mirrors, each image dimmer than the last. The grandmother still, the household's commanding voice, dismissed such talk. To her, their likeness was a blessing, proof that the bloodline remained unbroken. Purity, not pathology. But to outsiders, it was disturbing, too much sameness, too little difference, as though identity itself had eroded. In the absence of records, the children remain shadows. If their names were written, they were later erased. If their bodies were buried, their graves went unmarked. What endures are fragments, eyes drawn, too near words, delayed movements mirrored. They are remembered not as children, but as symptoms, not heirs, but echoes. And the doctrine the closed circle ended only with the woman who created it. For decades, the grandmother's authority had been the spine of the household, her voice shaping lineage, assigning roles, enforcing silence. But when she died, the fragile structure she maintained began to collapse into confusion. Death in Appalachia was usually marked by familiar customs, bodies washed within the home, coffins built from local pine neighbors gathering for a night-long vigil. But in the hollow, even this final ritual diverged. There was no church bell to toll her passing, no preacher summoned to speak words of comfort. Her body lay in the dim cabin, candles burning at its corners, guarded not by congregation, but by the family she had bound into silence. A neighbor who happened upon the scene later recalled seeing the coffin borne away at dusk, carried to the burial ground, and lowered into the earth without hymn or prayer. The service was as silent as her doctrine had been severe. And in her absence, the depth of the family's dependence on her will was revealed. While she lived, every role had been imposed and maintained with iron clarity. The girl as wife, the twin as husband, the father as shadowed presence. But with her gone, the lines she had carved unraveled. Who held authority now? Who claimed the children? Who spoke from the family Bible? Within the cabin walls, voices rose. Some insisted the twin remained the husband. Others whispered the father had reclaimed his place. Inheritance of land, of bodies of children, was not decided by law, but in arguments carried out in secrecy. Anthropological studies of mountain families describe fractures like these after the death of matriarchs. Without wills or legal deeds, disputes erupted among siblings and cousins, land seized by force, children shuffled between relatives without guardianship. Here the effect was magnified. Without the grandmother's control, overlapping roles of father, husband, uncle, and son collapsed into chaos. Each man could claim authority. Each child might be named 2 or 3 different ways. The family Bible, once her tool of order, became a battlefield. Some entries were crossed out, others scrawled over in different hands. Decades later, researchers who examined its pages saw layers of ink, generations rewritten and erased, each attempt to redefine kinship more desperate than the last. The false clarity she had enforced was gone, replaced with contradictions. Neighbors felt the collapse from outside. Where once the household moved in eerie, disciplined silence, they now heard shouting in the night, quarrels breaking through the trees. One woman said the cabin seemed cracked open, its fear leaking outward. The grandmother's burial marked more than the end of her life. It marked the disintegration of a system that, however cruel, had been coherent. Without her voice, the doctrine of symmetry dissolved. The hollow no longer concealed unity. It exposed fracture. What she had bound together in silence fell apart in argument. Bloodlines blurred, roles disputed, and the house once ruled by silence now rang with noise. The hollow grew empty, yet the records remained. By the early 20th century, the secretive household had been abandoned, its cabins collapsing under weather and neglect. Where voices had once whispered and her doctrine had ruled, only a deeper silence remained. No descendants carried the family name forward. Travelers in the 1920s spoke of lone chimneys, hearthstones buried in ivy, floorboards rotting into the soil. One recorded finding a cradle overturned in a corner, its wood brittle, as if the last child had been taken away without ceremony. Another discovered scattered bones near the burial ground, human unmarked graves either never dug or never kept. These remains bore no identity. They might have been children elders, or those caught in between. Without inscription, they simply merged into the earth without memory. The only artifact that endured was the family Bible found decades later by a farmer who bought land near the hollow. Its pages told as much in absence as in ink. Names were written, then struck through. Whole generations were obliterated by heavy strokes, faint impressions still ghosting beneath. What should have been a genealogy was instead a palimpsest, an overwritten text of concealment where erasure spoke louder than preservation. Scholars said the book carried the weight of suppression and effort not to remember, but to destroy memory. Folklore rose to fill the silence. In Appalachian oral tradition, stories abound of families who withdrew into themselves until nothing remained but rumor. This family became one of them. Locals told of the girl who wed her father's twin. Her name forgotten, her fate, remembered, retold as history, as legend, as ghost story. Children were warned not to stray near the hollow, lest they be taken by bloodlines that consumed themselves. Adults whispered of echoes in the valley, voices calling in pairs as if twins still lingered in the air. Anthropologists, collecting tales in the mid-20th century, noted how stubbornly the legend endured even after the cabins had crumbled to dust. Locals pointed to the ridge in hushed tones. Details shifted. Some claimed the children were buried beneath the floors, others that they vanished into the woods, but all stories circled back to the same figure, a girl bound to her father's mirror. A union sanctified by symmetry and sealed in silence. The hollow itself became a testimony. No new families settled there. Paths grew over wells, dried underbrush swallowed the ground. What nature reclaimed memory would not release. The place exists now as absence abandoned and stripped of inhabitants, yet weighted with what was once concealed. And so the record ends not with continuity, but with void. The family collapsed upon itself, leaving no heirs, no branches. What remains are fragments, a scattered bone, an erased Bible, the echo of folklore. In the hollow silence, returned to guard what it had once enforced. And in that silence, the bloodline vanished. Yet the story lingers. The cabins are gone, the graves unmarked, the names erased. But the tale survives in the whisper of a girl who married her father's twin, and in the warning that silence itself can be the loudest evidence of all. Where are you watching from tonight, and at what time? Write it below. I want to see how far this silence reaches. And if you want more histories that were never meant to be remembered, subscribe to Gothic Ledger and leave a like. Some families vanish. Their stories do not.